Welcome back to Shadows of History. It's always good to have you here again, settling in for another journey into the forgotten corners of the past. Tonight, we'll drift into the remarkable life of Violet Jessop, a woman who faced the sea at its most unforgiving, and lived to tell the tale. Before we begin, I'd love to know something from you. Every story feels different depending on how we experience it, so tell me in the comments. Are you listening to this to help you unwind before sleep, or are you the type who lets history play softly in the background while you go about your day? Whichever it is, get comfortable, let your mind slow down, and imagine yourself stepping back into the early 20th century, the era of great ships, quiet courage, and lives shaped by forces larger than themselves. Close your eyes and let the story begin gently, like the slow roll of waves against a wooden pier. Imagine yourself in the wide and windswept plains of Argentina at the end of the 19th century. The land stretches endlessly, painted with tall grasses that sway in the breeze, their tips catching the golden light of the sun. In the distance, cattle move in slow herds, their silhouettes broken only by the occasional tree or a whitewashed farmhouse. It is in this environment that Violet Constance Jessop was born. In 1887, the eldest daughter of Irish immigrants, her parents, William and Catherine, had come to Argentina seeking opportunity, like so many others. They were part of a wave of Irish families who believed that the fertile soils and open skies of South America would offer them a chance at a better life, away from the poverty and struggles of rural Ireland. Life here was demanding, though. The beauty of the pampas masked the difficulties of carving out a living. The summers could be blisteringly hot, with a dry wind that lifted the dust into every corner of a home. Winters were damp and chilly, with nights that stretched long and cold. For settlers like the Jessops, survival was a matter of resilience and constant work. Violet's father, William, worked with sheep shearing, tending, and managing flocks on the vast estancias that dominated the countryside. His hands were weathered by rope, by wool, by sun. Her mother, Catherine, kept the household running, raising 9 children and managing the unending rhythm of domestic life. Violet, as the eldest daughter, quickly learned responsibility. She became accustomed to caring for her younger siblings, to helping with chores, and to watching the horizon with a quiet sense of duty. But life, even in its ordinariness, was precarious. Disease was never far from the doorstep. Rural Argentina, like much of the world at the time, was haunted by tuberculosis, a silent illness that could sweep through families, leaving weakness and grief in its wake. When Violet was still young, she herself fell victim to it. Imagine the small farmhouse, its walls thick but not impenetrable to the damp air of winter. Inside, a little girl lies in bed, her body thin and frail, her breathing shallow and uneven. Doctors few and far between had little to offer beyond rest, fresh air, and hope. Violet's mother prayed, tended to her, and watched as her eldest child lingered on the edge of death for months. Many assumed the girl would not live. Her siblings tiptoed around the room, sensing the fragility of her condition, while life outside continued with its steady rhythm. Cattle driven past the house, wagons creaking along dirt tracks, winds whispering across the pampa. But Violet survived. Slowly, against expectation, she recovered. The illness left her pale and delicate for years afterward, yet it also imprinted on her something more enduring, a sense that life was fragile, uncertain, and something to be endured rather than guaranteed. This early confrontation with mortality would later shape the calm, almost stoic way she faced the disasters to come. Not long after Violet's recovery, tragedy struck the family again. William Jessop, her father, died suddenly. Accounts vary as to how, though illness is the most likely cause. His absence left Catherine, a widow with 9 children to care for, far from extended family or old friends back in Ireland. The pampas, vast and open, could suddenly feel lonely and unforgiving. Catherine made a difficult decision. She would take her children to England. It was a reversal of fortune, a recognition that their life in Argentina was unsustainable without the anchor of a father. For Violet, still a girl, this meant leaving behind the only land she had ever known: the wide skies, the smell of grass after rain, the heat of the summer sun, and stepping onto the long path back to the old world. Picture the journey: a ship at the docks, steam rising as workers load supplies. The Jessops carrying what little they could manage, boarding with tired but determined faces. For Catherine, it was a return to familiarity, but for her children, it was an uprooting. The sea voyage would be their first taste of the world that would later define Violet's life. The Atlantic crossing was no small thing. For emigrants and returnees alike, it was weeks of cramped quarters, rationed meals, and the ever-present movement of the ship. Days blurred together, measured by the clang of the ship's bell, the creak of timbers, and the sound of waves slapping against the hull. Nights were long, the stars endless above, the ocean vast and indifferent. For Violet, the crossing was both unsettling and strangely formative. She was not yet a seafarer, but the experience would be tucked away in her memory, to resurface when she later worked aboard ships. By the time the Jessops settled in England, Violet was a teenager. The landscapes were different here, not the flat pampas but the rolling fields and hedgerows of the British countryside, damp with rain and dotted with stone cottages. For Violet, the transition was not easy. She was Irish by blood, Argentine by birth, and now expected to adapt to English society, a society that, at the time, held strong class divisions and subtle prejudices against foreigners and those of Irish descent. Her mother, Catherine, found work as a stewardess on ocean liners, a position that offered steady pay and accommodation, though the hours were long and the expectations high. She worked for the Royal Mail Line, caring for passengers, managing linens, cleaning, and assisting wherever needed. Violet observed her mother's discipline, her calm in the face of demanding travelers, her ability to manage order amid the chaos of voyages. But then, once again, Catherine fell ill. This time it was not temporary. The responsibility of providing for the younger children fell to Violet, still only in her late teens. She faced a choice: remain ashore and find local work, or step into her mother's shoes and become a stewardess herself. It was a difficult decision, not least because Violet's health was still fragile, and the life of a stewardess was neither easy nor glamorous. It meant long hours of scrubbing, lifting, bending, and constant politeness. It meant dealing with seasickness, with the temperaments of strangers, with the endless cycle of cleaning and serving. Yet it also offered a way to support her family, a way to keep them together. So Violet applied. She presented herself for the role with neatness and determination. At first, she was told she was too young, too pretty, too delicate, qualities that shipping companies feared would distract male passengers or invite unwanted attention. But persistence won out. She was eventually taken on, beginning her career at sea in the early 1900s. Imagine her first day on board, the uniform stiff and unfamiliar, the corridors of the ship narrow and lined with polished wood, the smell of varnish mixed with salt air. She would have heard the calls of sailors, the footsteps of passengers, the low hum of the engines below. It was a world both contained and infinite, a floating society with its own rules and hierarchies. This then was Violet's new life, a stewardess at sea, supporting her family, stepping into a career that would inadvertently place her in the path of some of history's greatest maritime disasters. Picture the docks of Southampton in the early 1900s. The air is thick with the mingled scents of coal smoke and salt water. Horses clop along the cobblestones, pulling wagons piled with trunks, barrels, and sacks of provisions. Porters shout instructions, sailors heave ropes, and passengers wait anxiously, some dressed in their finest coats, others in simpler clothes, each carrying a story of departure and destination. Into this world stepped Violet Jessop, her crisp stewardess uniform newly issued, her hair neatly pinned back, her expression one of quiet determination. To most of the world she was just another young woman seeking work. But for Violet, this was the start of a vocation that would define her life in ways she could not yet imagine. Her first assignment was aboard one of the Royal Mail Line vessels, a far cry from the enormous ships that would later make history. These early ships were modest in size, carrying a mixture of passengers, wealthier travelers seeking comfort in first-class cabins, and emigrants housed in tighter quarters. For a stewardess, the duties were relentless. Her day would begin long before passengers stirred. At dawn, the bells of the ship marked the changing of watches, and Violet would already be on her feet, moving quietly through the corridors. She would check cabins, replace water pitchers, adjust bedding, and ensure that every detail was correct before the wealthier passengers awoke. Politeness and composure were essential, no matter how tired she felt. Meals brought their own set of challenges. In the grand dining saloons, passengers expected elegance, silverware polished to a shine, linens perfectly folded, courses arriving in steady rhythm. Behind the scenes, stewardesses like Violet carried trays, fetched requests, soothed complaints, and maintained an air of calm efficiency. It was not glamorous, but it required skill and composure. The higher the class of the passenger, the greater the demand for perfection. Life below decks told a different story. In steerage, where hundreds of emigrants traveled in cramped quarters, the atmosphere was less refined. The air was thicker, filled with the smell of unwashed clothes, damp wool, and the ever-present hint of seasickness. Here too, Violet sometimes worked, helping mothers with restless children, offering cups of broth to passengers who had not yet found their sea legs, or providing a reassuring presence in the dimly lit dormitory-like rooms. What stands out, looking back, is the way Violet managed to blend into the background while still being essential. A stewardess was meant to be seen only when needed, polite, efficient, almost invisible, yet she had to be everywhere, constantly attentive, always ready to respond to the whims or worries of those in her care. It was a demanding balance, one she learned quickly. The rhythm of life at sea began to weave itself into her. There was the steady throb of the engines deep below, a vibration that became the background to every moment of her work. There was the salt air that clung to her uniform, the Thames of sea spray that sometimes drifted through open portholes. There was the sound of gulls circling as the ship departed port, and the long low blast of the whistle announcing departure. And there were the passengers themselves, individuals from every walk of life, each with their quirks. Violet would later remark in her memoirs that she encountered all manner of people, kind, difficult, eccentric, lonely. She learned to read moods, to anticipate requests, to navigate delicate situations with patience. The ship was a microcosm of society, and she was one of its quiet caretakers. When her mother's illness deepened, Violet had no choice but to remain at sea. Her wages helped sustain the younger children, and though the work was exhausting, it offered stability that land-based jobs often did not. Each voyage took her farther afield across the Channel, through the Atlantic, sometimes to more distant ports. With each departure, she grew more accustomed to the constant cycle of leaving and returning, of arrivals and goodbyes. By the time she transferred from the Royal Mail Line to the White Star liner, company renowned for its grand ocean liners, she was no longer the inexperienced girl shadowing her mother's example. She was a professional in her own right, respected among her colleagues, known for her composure and reliability. Imagine her first impressions of the larger ships. Compared to the smaller vessels she had served on, these liners were floating palaces. Their scale was almost overwhelming. Soaring smokestacks, sweeping decks, dining rooms with chandeliers and gilded details. For passengers, they were symbols of prestige and modernity. For Violet, they represented both greater opportunity and greater challenge. She was assigned to serve first-class passengers. This required a new level of polish. Gowns laid out with precision, hairbrushes and mirrors arranged just so, constant attentiveness to the smallest requests. The wealthy elite who traveled first class often expected a kind of deference that bordered on theatrical. Some were kind and gracious, others demanding or dismissive. Violet endured them all with the same calm, patience, careful never to let irritation show. Still, the glamour of the surroundings could not mask the reality of the work. Hours were long, breaks scarce, and the physical demands relentless. She moved swiftly from cabin to cabin, always in motion, her feet aching by nightfall. Seasickness was common, not just among passengers, but among crew. And while first-class areas gleamed, the workspaces of the staff were cramped, hot, and functional. It was in these years, before the Titanic, that Violet honed the resilience she would become known for. She learned to find steadiness in routine, to keep her mind calm in the face of storms both literal and social. She became accustomed to the ocean's moods, the glassy calm of a summer crossing, the restless waves of autumn, the violent storms that tossed the ship so that dishes slid across tables and passengers clutched at railings. For Violet, the sea was no longer unfamiliar. It had become her second home, its unpredictability woven into the fabric of her life. She did not know then how this familiarity would be tested, or how it would place her at the center of events that would later be remembered by the entire world. By 1910, the White Star Line had placed its hopes in a trio of ships that would redefine ocean travel: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. They were to be the largest and most luxurious liners ever constructed, symbols of modern engineering and national pride. For Violet Jessop, the opportunity to work aboard such a vessel marked both a professional achievement and a new chapter in her life at sea. When she stepped aboard the Olympic for the first time, she was struck by its vastness. The ship seemed to stretch endlessly, its decks broad and gleaming, its staircases sweeping upward in graceful curves. They reflected an almost palatial ambition: polished wood paneling, glittering light fixtures, plush carpets. Everything was designed to project a sense of confidence, wealth, and modernity. For passengers, this was travel elevated to an art form. For Violet and her fellow crew members, it was a workplace unlike any they had known. Her duties as a stewardess remained centered on the first-class passengers, But the Olympic introduced new layers of complexity. The sheer number of travelers meant longer corridors, more cabins, and a constant flow of requests. There was always a bell ringing, always a passenger in need of assistance. She became adept at moving quickly and quietly, appearing precisely when required, and disappearing again without fuss. Her colleagues formed a close-knit community, bound together by the shared demands of shipboard life. Among the stewardesses, camaraderie grew through long hours and shared challenges. The crew lived in modest quarters, with narrow bunks and little personal space, but within those confines they forged friendships and mutual respect. Life below decks was starkly different from the grandeur above, yet it possessed its own rhythms and rituals. Tea shared in snatched moments, songs hummed in the laundry rooms, conversations whispered in the passageways. Violet, reserved but observant, noticed how the grandeur of the ship often created illusions. Passengers marveled at the opulence, at the chandeliers and fine dining, and often forgot the immense machinery churning below, the stokers feeding coal into the great furnaces, the engineers monitoring gauges in sweltering heat. The Olympic, like every ship, was a balance of visible elegance and hidden labor. One of the defining moments of her service aboard the Olympic occurred in September 1911, when the ship collided with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke near the Isle of Wight. Though the accident caused significant damage to the Olympic, she managed to return to port under her own power. For Violet and the crew, it was a sobering reminder that even the most advanced vessels were vulnerable. Passengers were shaken but largely unharmed, and Violet later recalled the calm professionalism required of the staff during that tense time. It was, in retrospect, an eerie foreshadowing of what was to come. Despite the incident, the Olympic continued her service, and Violet remained aboard, refining her skills and maintaining her steady composure. She had grown accustomed to the unique world of the great liners, the daily inspections, the constant interaction with passengers, the necessity of patience and discretion. She saw both the best and the worst of human behavior, acts of kindness and generosity alongside entitlement and arrogance. Through it all she remained calm, a quiet presence who smoothed the edges of shipboard life. In 1912, Violet was transferred to the Titanic. At the time, it seemed a natural progression, almost a reward for her years of reliable service. The Titanic was to be the pride of the White Star Line, larger and even more luxurious than her sister ship. For Violet, it was simply another assignment, another set of cabins to tend, another voyage to complete. She could not have known that the journey would place her at the center of one of history's most enduring tragedies. As the date of the maiden voyage approached, Southampton buzzed with excitement. The docks filled with onlookers eager to glimpse the great ship, while passengers prepared for their journey with anticipation. Crew members, too, felt the weight of expectation. Uniforms were checked, duties assigned, every detail scrutinized. For Violet, it was another embarkation day, another moment to compose herself before stepping once more into the rhythm of service. She likely paused, as she often did, to take in the atmosphere of departure, the gulls circling overhead, the thick ropes coiled on the quay, the smell of salt and coal smoke mingling in the spring air. It was familiar, almost comforting, yet within days, this voyage would become unlike any other she had known. In April of 1912, Violet Jessop received her assignment to the Titanic. She had served aboard the Olympic long enough to become familiar with the grandeur and demands of these vast liners, and the transition felt at first like a continuation of what she already knew. To her, the Titanic was not a symbol of modern invincibility or a monument to progress. It was, simply, her place of work. And yet, when she first stepped aboard, even she must have paused to take in the sheer scale. The Titanic was, in every sense, immense. Her decks stretched endlessly, her cabins seemed countless, her dining rooms and lounges glowed with a brilliance that rivaled fine hotels on land. Polished brass gleamed in the lamplight, carpets muffled footsteps, the scent of fresh paint and new wood lingered in the air, mingling with the tang of sea salt. For Violet, the routine began immediately. Each stewardess had a set of cabins assigned, most of them in first class, though sometimes duties extended into second. Her role was practical, almost invisible. She laid out bed linens, ensured that fresh water and towels were supplied, attended to passengers' requests, and offered calm assistance when seasickness or fatigue took its toll. The work was repetitive, yet it required patience, poise, and quiet efficiency. Passengers in first class lived lives of abundance even at sea. Violet moved through ornate staterooms where ladies unpacked trunks filled with silk gowns and jewels, and where men discussed business or leisure over cigars. She saw families embarking on what they believed would be an elegant crossing, children wide-eyed at the novelty of such a magnificent vessel. She also glimpsed those traveling in steerage, carrying fewer belongings but just as much hope, bound for new lives in America. The crew, meanwhile, settled into their own patterns. They dined separately, slept in their compact quarters, and worked long shifts. For Violet, as for many others, the hierarchy was clear: passengers above, crew below. Yet there was also a sense of pride in being part of such a grand undertaking. The Titanic represented more than a voyage. It was a floating city, a place where lives intersected briefly before scattering again at journey's end. The days at sea unfolded with a steady rhythm. Violet rose early, ensuring that her passengers' needs were met before breakfast. She walked the long corridors, listening for the ring of service bells, the quiet knock of requests at her door. The ship's engines provided a constant backdrop, a low hum that seemed to pulse through the walls and floors. At times she might pause, feeling the vibration beneath her feet, a reminder of the great machinery carrying them forward. Meals in first class were elaborate affairs. Stewards carried silver trays laden with fine dishes, glasses sparkled in the light, and conversation flowed easily. Violet was present on the periphery, observing without intruding. She learned to read moods quickly, to anticipate requests before they were voiced, to disappear when privacy was desired. Her presence was meant to be felt as helpful but never obtrusive. For those in second class, life aboard the Titanic was more modest, but still comfortable. Cabins were smaller, meals simpler, but the atmosphere remained orderly and respectable. In steerage, conditions were plainer still, with crowded dormitories and shared facilities. Yet even there, music and laughter could be heard, as families and groups of travelers found ways to make the long voyage tolerable. Throughout it all, Violet remained steady, attentive, and calm. She had, by this point, mastered the art of detachment. Passengers might confide their worries or frustrations, but she absorbed them with quiet composure. She was not there to judge, only to assist. In her memoirs, she later recalled these days aboard the Titanic with a tone of matter-of-factness, as though the scale and grandeur had quickly become part of the background of her working life. Yet beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of belief that the ship was unsinkable. Crew and passengers alike carried this assumption, spoken openly in conversations and reported proudly in the press. The Titanic, they said, represented the triumph of technology over nature. It was, many believed, beyond failure. Violet, practical and experienced, may have taken such claims with quiet skepticism. Ships, after all, were still vulnerable to weather, to human error, to chance. She had already seen the Olympic collide with another vessel, and she knew that no machine was flawless. Still, the general atmosphere of confidence was impossible to ignore. Evenings on board were filled with activity. First-class passengers gathered in lounges, music floated through the air, and the great staircase served as both passageway and stage for elegant appearances. Violet moved through this world quietly, her presence unnoticed by most. She likely found small moments of rest during her overwars, perhaps stepping onto the open deck to feel the cool air and listen to the sea. There, away from the bustle, she might have reflected on her own path, from Argentina to England, from illness to survival, from modest beginnings to the service of the world's wealthiest travelers. The crossing was smooth in its early days. The weather was fair, the seas calm, the schedule precise. To many it must have felt like an ordinary voyage, albeit aboard an extraordinary ship. For Violet, it was work as usual, demanding, constant, yet familiar. She could not have known that within days, the routine would shatter, and the Titanic would become not merely a workplace but a place of survival. The 14th of April 1912 began like any other day at sea. For Violet Jessop it unfolded with the steady rhythm of service, morning duties, meals, tidying, staterooms, quiet conversations with passengers. The air was crisp, the sky bright, and the sea remarkably calm, so calm that some described it as a sheet of glass, undisturbed by waves. It was, in many ways, an ordinary day in the life of a stewardess. Passengers enjoyed the leisure of a Sunday voyage. Families strolled the decks, couples lingered in the sun, and children played under watchful eyes. In first class, ladies admired the fashions of one another's gowns, while men spoke of business prospects in America. In second class, travelers read books in the library, enjoyed music, or took in the sea air. Below, in steerage, laughter and song carried faintly upward, mingling with the hum of the ship's engines. For Violet, The hours were filled with her familiar routine. She moved quietly from cabin to cabin, ensuring that everything remained in order. She answered questions, offered assistance, and provided the kind of constant presence that made passengers feel cared for. The ship, vast though it was, seemed to operate with remarkable harmony. By evening, the temperature had begun to drop. The air grew sharper and passengers on deck wrapped themselves in coats and scarves. The sea, still unnaturally calm, reflected the stars above with a clarity that made the horizon nearly indistinguishable. In the dining saloons and lounges, conversations carried on late into the night. For many, it was an evening like any other. At a little before midnight, Violet was resting in her quarters, when she felt the faintest jolt. It was subtle, a shiver that ran through the ship's frame, a slight vibration beneath the floor. She might have thought little of it at first. Ships often shifted, engines often produced small tremors. Yet, as the minutes passed, there was a change in the atmosphere. Crew members began moving with greater urgency, voices carried with a tone of restraint, and the rhythm of the ship felt less certain. Soon, word spread quietly. The ship had struck something, an iceberg. Passengers at first seemed unaware of the seriousness. Some dressed in their coats and came onto the decks to peer curiously into the night. Others remained inside, reluctant to leave the warmth of their cabins. The officers and stewards moved with calm efficiency, encouraging people to put on life jackets, to gather quietly, to prepare for what was at that moment only described as precautionary. Violet, trained by years of service, remained steady. Her duty was not to panic but to reassure. She helped passengers down their cork life jackets, fastening the ties with practiced hands. She guided them toward the lifeboats, speaking with a tone of calm encouragement. Later, she would recall that she herself was handed a life jacket by another steward and told to come along as an example for hesitant passengers. If the stewardess wore one, surely they ought to as well. The night air was piercing cold. On deck, the silence of the sea stretched endlessly, broken only by the groaning of the ship and the voices of those gathered. The iceberg itself was barely visible, a pale shadow against the darker sky. But the evidence of collision became clearer as the crew worked. The Titanic had been wounded. Water was pouring into her lower compartments. The ship, declared unsinkable, was slowly beginning to sink. At first, few believed it. The atmosphere carried an odd mixture of curiosity and denial. Some passengers even laughed quietly, dismissing the situation as nothing more than an inconvenience. Others resisted boarding the lifeboats, reluctant to step into small open boats, when they could remain on what still seemed like a solid and luxurious vessel. It was in this atmosphere that the crew had to act with patience and persistence, coaxing and guiding, reassuring and directing. Violet observed it all with her usual composure. She assisted where she could, offering a steady presence amid the confusion. She would later remember being placed into a lifeboat, not as a passenger but to demonstrate its safety to others. As she sat among women and children, the boat was lowered into the freezing night air, down the immense side of the ship. Above, the decks loomed, filled with figures moving back and forth, voices calling out into the darkness. The descent into the water was slow, creaking, unnerving. When at last the lifeboat reached the sea, the reality of their isolation became clear. The Titanic, still vast and illuminated, rose above them like a floating palace. Lights glowed in her windows, smoke trailed faintly from her funnels, and music from the band carried faintly over the water. From the lifeboat's perspective, the ship seemed unshakable still, a towering city against the starlit horizon. But as the minutes turned to hours, the tilt of the decks grew sharper. The sounds of the ship changed, a deeper groan, a shuddering movement, the rush of water filling spaces below. Passengers in the lifeboats sat in stunned silence, wrapped in blankets, huddled together against the cold. Violet, like so many others, could do little but watch. The night was filled with contrasts, the calm of the sea, the brilliance of the stars, the music of the band playing hymns, all against the slow, unstoppable descent of the great liner. There was no chaos in Violet's recollections, only a kind of terrible stillness. Voices carried across the water, muffled by distance, but the sense of inevitability hung in the air. In time, the bow slipped beneath the waves, the stern rose higher, the lights flickered, and the ship groaned with immense strain. And then, at last, the Titanic was gone. Where there had been grandeur, there was now only darkness and silence, broken by the lapping of waves against the small wooden boat. Violet survived the night as she had survived so many hardships before. She sat among the passengers in the lifeboat, breathing in the frozen air, waiting for rescue. The Carpathia would arrive hours later, hauling the survivors aboard, giving them blankets and hot drinks, offering what comfort they could. But the memory of that night, of the lights sinking into the sea, of the stillness, of the unimaginable scale of loss, would never leave her. For Violet Jessop, the Titanic was not the end of her story. It was one chapter among many, and though the ship sank beneath her, she endured, calm and composed, carrying with her the memories of that night for the rest of her life. The hours that followed the sinking of the Titanic were long, cold, and strangely quiet. The survivors sat huddled in their lifeboats, drifting on the calm Atlantic under a canopy of stars. The air was sharp, cutting against their skin, and the silence carried a weight that few could put into words. Now and again, a creak of wood, the dip of an oar, or the faint murmur of voices broke the stillness. But for the most part, the night stretched endlessly, a cold reminder of all that had been lost. For Violet Jessop, the lifeboat was both refuge and prison. She had escaped the sinking, yet she remained trapped on the open sea with dozens of others, waiting for help that might or might not arrive. Hours passed, marked only by the slow turning of stars overhead and the numbing ache of cold in fingers and toes. Those seated beside her shifted little, conserving what little energy they had. The children slept fitfully, clinging to their mothers, while adults sat in silent endurance. Eventually, a faint light appeared on the horizon. At first it was no more than a pinprick, easily mistaken for a star, but gradually it grew, flickering, steadying, and revealing itself to be the lights of a ship. The Carpathia, a Cunard liner, had received the Titanic's distress call and steamed through the night at full speed, braving ice fields to reach the coordinates. For the exhausted and freezing survivors, the sight of her lights was salvation itself. As dawn began to break, the Carpathia loomed larger. Her decks were crowded with crew and passengers, ready to receive those plucked from the lifeboats. One by one, the small wooden boats approached her side. Ropes were thrown down, nets were lowered, and survivors were hauled up with as much care as could be given. Violet, weary and stiff, found herself among those lifted aboard. The transition from the freezing open sea to the relative warmth of the ship was overwhelming. Blankets wrapped around her shoulders, a warm drink pressed into her hands, voices offering comfort in tones she could scarcely process. The atmosphere on the Carpathia was subdued, yet heavy with compassion. Passengers gave up their cabins, their clothing, their meals for those who had endured the night. Violet, accustomed to serving others, now found herself the recipient of such kindness. She was too exhausted to speak much, too overwhelmed to fully process the enormity of what had passed. Yet she remembered the small gestures, a cup of tea steaming against her face, the rough wool of a borrowed coat, the murmured words of reassurance from strangers. For days, the Carpathia carried the survivors toward New York. On board, grief settled like a shroud. Some wept quietly, others sat in silence, and still others searched desperately for loved ones who had not survived. Violet moved quietly through it all, offering assistance where she could, even though she too carried her own burden of loss. She was not simply a stewardess now. She was a survivor, bound by experience to the hundreds around her. When at last the Carpathia reached New York Harbor, crowds lined the docks. Newspapers had already spread word of the disaster, and the world waited with bated breath for details. For Violet, stepping off the ship was like crossing into another reality. The noise of the city, the press of reporters, the clamor of voices felt a world apart from the frozen stillness of the Atlantic. She, who had spent her life in service at sea, now carried with her memories that few could comprehend. The Titanic disaster might have ended her maritime career. Many who survived never set foot on a ship again. Yet Violet did not retreat. Instead, after time to recover, she returned to sea. Her reasons were practical. She needed her livelihood, her income, her independence, but they also spoke to a deeper resilience. Though she had faced one of the most infamous disasters in maritime history, she did not let fear control her path. In the years that followed, Violet would look back on the Titanic not as the defining moment of her life, but as one chapter among many. She remembered the faces of those she helped, the quiet endurance of the passengers, the stillness of the night sky above the sinking ship. She remembered the band's music, the light fading into the sea, and the strange calm that settled over it all. These memories, etched into her mind, became part of the fabric of her story. And yet, remarkable as it was, the Titanic was not her only brush with disaster. Fate, it seemed, had other plans for Violet Jessop. She had survived one shipwreck, but there were two more yet to come, and with each her resilience would be tested again. By the time Europe plunged into the First World War, Violet Jessop had already endured more at sea than most would in a lifetime. She had worked through the quiet rhythms of service aboard great liners, and she had survived the chaos of the Titanic. But war changed the seas entirely. Passenger liners were converted into troop ships and hospital ships. Merchant vessels sailed under constant threat of mines and submarines. The waters that had once carried vacationers and hopeful emigrants became battle zones. Violet, still committed to her profession, joined the ranks of those who served aboard hospital ships. She trained with the Red Cross and signed on to the Britannic, the third and largest of the Great White Star Line, Olympic-class liners, sister ship to both the Olympic and the Titanic. Where the Titanic had been hailed as a marvel of luxury, the Britannic was outfitted for service in war. Instead of wealthy passengers strolling her decks, she carried doctors, nurses, and wounded soldiers. Her once lavish dining rooms were repurposed into operating theaters and recovery wards. For Violet, the work was demanding, yet familiar in its rhythm. The hospital ship became a floating city of care and recovery. She awoke each day to the call of duty, donning her uniform and tending to the endless needs of patients. She carried trays of meals, brought water, helped with bedding, and soothed anxious men who had come from the front. The air was tinged with the scent of antiseptic, the sounds filled with footsteps, groans, and the clipped voices of medical staff. Though war pressed heavily on all who served, the Britannic was thought to be safe. Painted in bright stripes with giant red crosses on her hull, she was clearly marked as a hospital ship, in theory protected under international law. She sailed through the Aegean Sea, ferrying the wounded from campaigns in the Balkans and the Dardanelles back to safety. Violet, who had lived through one infamous disaster, reassured herself that lightning would not strike twice. But fate, as it seemed, had not finished with her. On the morning of November 21, 1916, the Britannic was steaming through the Aegean near the island of Kea. The sun had risen bright, casting a golden sheen across the calm sea. Crew and nurses moved through their routines, preparing for the day's work. Violet herself was in her cabin when a sudden, deafening explosion tore through the ship. The sound reverberated through steel bulkheads, a violent shock that shook her off her feet. The ship had struck a mine, likely laid by a German submarine. Almost immediately, the Britannic began to list. The blast had ripped through compartments, and water rushed in with terrifying speed. Though designed to be safer than her sister, the Titanic, the Britannic now faced the same mortal danger. Her bulkheads could not hold back the sea. Alarms rang, orders were shouted, and those aboard rushed to their stations. Nurses gathered patients, crew readied lifeboats, and the great vessel groaned as she tilted further. Violet, drawing on her past experience, moved with a calm born of familiarity. She knew the steps of evacuation, knew how to guide others, knew that panic was the enemy. She helped where she could, gathering what was needed and making her way toward the lifeboats. The scene on deck was both disciplined and chaotic. Unlike the Titanic, the Britannic carried enough lifeboats for all, and her crew had drilled repeatedly for emergencies. But the list of the ship made lowering them perilous. Some boats swung wildly against the hull, others dropped unevenly into the water. Time was short. The great liner was sinking fast, pulled down by the sea at a speed that astonished even those who had seen ships go down before. Violet boarded a lifeboat with others, heart steady, mind focused on survival. But as the boat was lowered and unforeseen danger revealed itself, the Britannic's enormous propellers, still turning beneath the waterline, drew the sea, and everything in it, toward their massive blades. Lifeboats caught in the current were sucked into the deadly pull. Men shouted warnings, boats collided, and chaos broke through the fragile order. In that moment, Violet acted with clarity. Realizing the peril, she leaped from the lifeboat into the cold sea, striking the water hard. She felt herself pulled by the current, dragged toward the thrashing churn of the propellers. With desperate strength, she swam sideways, pushing against the suction. The effort was nearly overwhelming, but at last she broke free, surfacing amid wreckage and cries. Around her, the lifeboat she had just abandoned was destroyed, splintered by the blades. Yet Violet, by instinct and courage, had once again survived. She struck out toward another boat, hauling herself aboard, soaked and bruised but alive. Minutes later, the Britannic gave her final groan and slipped beneath the waves. Unlike the Titanic, she sank quickly in just 55 minutes, her massive hull vanishing into the depths. The sea, so calm and golden at dawn, now floated with wreckage and lifeboats filled with survivors. Of the more than 1,000 aboard, most escaped, though 30 lives were lost. For Violet, the shock of survival was profound. Twice now she had stood on great liners as they met their end. Twice she had endured the unthinkable, emerging alive while so many had not. The odds of such an experience were staggering, yet here she was, cold, shaken, but breathing. In the days that followed, survivors whispered of curses and fate. How could one woman have endured both the Titanic and the Britannic? Was she blessed by Providence or marked by misfortune? Some half joked that she carried bad luck with her, though such words were said with uneasy laughter. Violet herself rejected superstition. To her, survival was not a matter of fate but of circumstance, training, and composure. Yet even she could not deny the strangeness of it all. The Britannic's wreck lay in the Aegean, her bones joining those of her sister in the Atlantic. Violet carried on, scarred but unbroken. She would later reflect that the jump from the lifeboat left her with a lasting injury, a head trauma that caused occasional discomfort throughout her life. But she did not dwell on it. What mattered was that she had endured, and that she had done her duty to the last. Thus, the legend of Violet Jessop deepened. No longer merely the stewardess who survived the Titanic, she was now the nurse who had also survived the sinking of the Britannic. In time, her story would take on an almost mythical quality, a tale told in whispers of the woman who could not sink. In the years that followed the sinking of the Britannic, Violet's reputation began to take on a shape larger than her own quiet life. Within maritime circles, among sailors, stewards, and officers, she was already known as a woman of remarkable composure, someone who could be trusted in a crisis. But outside those circles, as her story circulated, it became infused with something more, a sense of the uncanny. Imagine yourself for a moment in 1916, reading newspapers that told of shipwrecks with alarming regularity. War dominated the headlines, but stories of sinkings, merchant vessels torpedoed, warships lost, civilian liners struck by mines, were woven into the daily news cycle. It was a time when the sea seemed cursed, when travel across the waves carried more dread than adventure. To learn, in that climate, of a single woman who had not only endured the Titanic, but also another great disaster was to encounter something almost unbelievable. Whispers spread, as whispers always do, that Violet Jessop was a figure marked by fate. Some said she was blessed, watched over by Providence. Others suggested, with uneasy humor, that she carried ill luck wherever she went. Among sailors, who were famously superstitious, her presence could spark both admiration and apprehension. She was living proof of survival against impossible odds, but to some she was also an omen, a reminder of the thin line between safety and catastrophe. Yet Violet herself, in her writings and reflections, never indulged these notions. She described her experiences plainly, even with a touch of understatement. Where others saw destiny, she saw circumstance. She had been aboard ships because she had to work, because her livelihood depended on it. She had survived not through miracle but through preparation, composure, and yes, a measure of fortune. Still, the cultural imagination clung to her story, shaping it into something almost mythic. The Titanic itself had already become a symbol by this time, of hubris, of technological pride meeting the cold power of nature. The Britannic, though less famous, deepened that symbol. These were not obscure vessels, they were icons of an age that believed in progress, in engineering that could master the sea. Their loss, and Violet's survival within them, carried metaphorical weight. It was as if she herself had become a thread running through the unraveling fabric of modern confidence. Consider, too, the gendered dimension of her tale. In an era when women were often overlooked in the narratives of war and disaster, Violet's survival placed her squarely in the story. She was not a passive figure carried along by events, but an active participant, a worker, a nurse, a woman performing her duty even as the world fell apart around her. Her presence challenged expectations, reminding those who heard her story that courage and resilience were not confined to uniformed men at the front. Among passengers and crew who had sailed with her, memories lingered of her calm demeanor. She was not given to panic, nor did she allow others to fall into it. Such qualities, though less dramatic than feats of heroism on the battlefield, were essential in crises. Quietly, almost invisibly, she embodied a form of courage that was both practical and humane. The cultural resonance of her story was further shaped by the way disasters at sea were remembered. Shipwrecks have always occupied a strange place in human imagination, tragic yet romantic, terrifying yet compelling. They are tales of hubris, of nature's power, of human error and endurance. From ancient epics to modern headlines, the sinking of ships has served as metaphor for life itself, fragile, precarious, subject to forces beyond our control. Yet, in the face of such tragedy, Violet Jessop remained steadfast. Violet's survival across multiple wrecks gave her story a symbolic density that few could ignore. Some, in later years, would even dub her Miss Unsinkable. The title, half jest and half reverence, encapsulated the mystery people projected onto her life. Of course, she was not truly unsinkable. She had endured trauma, injury, and loss. But the phrase captured the cultural fascination with her improbable record. It suggested that she had become more than an individual. She was a figure in whom people could invest their anxieties and their hopes. And behind the legend lay the quieter truths of her personal reflections. She admitted, in her memoirs, that the disasters left her with lasting fears. She confessed to moments of hesitation before boarding ships again. 2 sleepless nights replaying the sound of explosions or the tilt of a sinking deck. She was human, not mythic, and the weight of her experiences lingered. Yet she persisted. She returned to sea again and again, driven by necessity, resilience, and perhaps a certain acceptance that fate would do what it would, regardless of her fears. In this, Violet embodied a cultural lesson as well. For ordinary people in the early 20th century, whether living through war, economic hardship, or personal loss, the message was familiar. Life continued. Disasters came and went, but the rhythms of duty and survival endured. Violet did not withdraw from the sea after her experiences. She embraced it again, with steady resolve. That persistence itself became part of the story people told about her. There was also a spiritual undertone to the way her survival was discussed. The era was one in which spiritualism and ideas of fate and destiny carried weight in public imagination. To hear of Violet's repeated deliverance was to wonder if unseen forces were at work. Some might have thought of guardian angels, others of curses or karma. In a world battered by war and uncertainty, such stories provided frameworks for understanding events that defied ordinary logic. And so Violet's tale was not merely personal but cultural. It reflected the anxieties of her time, the symbols of a collapsing age, and the resilience of ordinary individuals. She became both a real woman and a character in a broader narrative about survival, fate, and the mysteries of the sea. As time passed, Violet's story moved from living memory into history. She herself lived quietly after the war, continuing her service on ocean liners, then retiring to a modest life in Suffolk. But the ships she had sailed on, especially the Titanic and the Britannic, began to take on a life of their own. They were no longer just ships that had been lost. They became symbols, legends, and eventually, subjects of historical excavation. When the wreck of the Titanic was discovered in 1985, it rekindled global fascination. Images of the broken hull lying on the seabed were broadcast around the world. The ocean floor revealed details both haunting and beautiful. Chandeliers still hanging, porcelain dishes scattered, shoes and suitcases resting silently in the deep. It was not only a wreck but a time capsule, and for those who remembered Violet's story, it was impossible not to think of her, a living witness who had once walked those decks, who had escaped as the ship gave its final breath. In that moment, her life bridged to worlds, the lived reality of 1912 and the technological gaze of modern archaeology. She had carried her memories quietly, even modestly, yet they now intersected with a global narrative. Every new detail discovered about the wreck brought her experience back into focus. The Britannic, too, drew divers and researchers. Resting in shallower waters of the Aegean Sea, it was more accessible than the Titanic. Divers found its vast hull tilted on its side, remarkably preserved. Exploring it was dangerous but illuminating, a reminder of how swiftly a vessel thought unsinkable could be undone. Violet's survival of that disaster was recalled in these explorations, turning her life into a touchstone for historical inquiry. The archaeological study of these wrecks reshaped Violet's story yet again. What she had lived, the sounds, the fear, the chaos, became anchored to physical evidence lying deep below the waves. The cold iron of the hulls, the twisted beams, the silent cabins, they bore mute witness to what survivors like Violet had once described. In this way, her memories gained a kind of corroboration, a bridge between personal testimony and physical history. The cultural fascination with these shipwrecks also extended into film, literature, and popular imagination. Novels retold the sinking of the Titanic with various shades of drama and romance. Later, Hollywood would immortalize it in ways Violet herself could never have imagined. Though she had passed away in 1971, her life story resonated more strongly than ever in these retellings. She had been part of something larger than herself, and so her memory was carried along with the ship's legend. What is striking, however, is that Violet never sought to capitalize on her survival. In her memoirs, written in later years and published posthumously, she described her experiences plainly, almost matter-of-factly. There was no sense of seeking fame or recognition. For her, survival had not been a spectacle but a necessity. She had endured because she had to. She had gone back to sea because it was her livelihood. Her resilience was not heroic in the grand, cinematic sense, but steady, practical, human. This contrast between her quiet telling and the grand cultural myth that grew around her is telling. It reminds us of how history often works. The lived reality of ordinary people becomes magnified, reshaped, and sometimes mythologized by those who come after. Violet's life, viewed in isolation, was one of work, endurance, and modest retirement. Yet in the broader lens of cultural memory, it became extraordinary, almost legendary. It is worth pausing to reflect on how her story echoes older traditions of folklore and myth. Human societies have long told tales of those who cheat death, who survive disasters, who emerge from catastrophe seemingly chosen by fate. These stories have always carried a dual edge, admiration for resilience and unease at the mystery of survival. Violet's life tapped into this ancient pattern. Though she lived in the modern era of steel ships and wireless communication, her story could just as easily have belonged to the age of epic poems and oral legend. And so her memory lingers, not only in archives and books, but in the imagination. Divers still visit the wrecks she once escaped. Readers still turn to her memoirs for a glimpse into the quiet voice of a woman who had seen so much and said so little. Audiences still find themselves drawn to her improbable string of survivals, wondering how one life could intersect with so many calamities. What we find, ultimately, is a kind of paradox. Violet Jessop was at once utterly ordinary, a stewardess, a nurse, a woman working to support herself, and utterly extraordinary, marked by fate in ways few could fathom. That paradox is what keeps her story alive. She belonged to history, to culture, and, perhaps, to myth. As segment 3 draws to a close, let us carry forward the image of Violet not only as Miss Unsinkable, but as a bridge between memory and history, between individual endurance and collective imagination, between the quiet voice of lived experience and the grand narratives that shape our understanding of the past. Life aboard the great liners of the early 20th century was, above all else, a study in contrasts. These ships were not just vessels moving across the Atlantic, they were floating microcosms of society itself, with its sharp divisions of class, wealth, and opportunity. The Titanic, the Olympic, and the Britannic all reflected the rigid social hierarchies of their time, and Violet Jessop, by the very nature of her position as a stewardess, lived in the midst of those divides. Imagine yourself walking through the ship from bow to stern, beginning at the upper decks where the first-class passengers resided. The air is lighter there, filled with the fragrance of fine cigars and the scent of perfume carried on silk scarves. Gentle laughter floats from cardrooms where men in tailored suits and women in evening gowns pass the time with bridge or quiet conversation. There are gilded dining saloons with crystal chandeliers, vast libraries with soft carpets, and promenades designed for leisure walks in the sea air. Everything in this world is designed to reassure the wealthy that even at sea, far from the comforts of London, Paris, or New York, they would lack nothing. Now descend a deck or two, and the atmosphere changes. The second-class accommodations were comfortable, even pleasant, offering middle-class travelers a sense of refinement without the excess of the upper deck. Their cabins were smaller but tidy, their meals hearty though less elaborate. The social atmosphere was more modest, yet still marked by civility and aspiration. For many of these travelers, second class was not just a ticket across the ocean, it was a taste of respectability, an affirmation of their place in a growing middle society. Continue still further downward, to the lower decks, and you step into another world altogether. Here lived the third-class passengers, families, laborers, immigrants. The air was heavier, tinged with the smell of coal dust carried up from the boiler rooms and the simpler fare served in their dining halls. Cabins were crowded, and communal spaces echoed with the sounds of children playing, babies crying, and songs sung in many different languages. These were the hopeful voyagers, leaving behind old worlds in search of new. For them, the voyage was not a holiday but a passage, the threshold to another life. And woven between these worlds, moving silently and tirelessly, were the crew. Men and women who made the great machine of the ship function, who carried trays, polished brass rails, cleaned cabins, and tended fires in the furnaces. Among them was Violet. Her role as stewardess placed her in constant contact with passengers, yet never allowed her to belong to their world. She served, but she did not share in the luxury. She moved among the wealthy but slept in modest quarters below. She heard the conversations of elites, but was never invited to join. This dual existence defined much of her life at sea. She belonged neither fully above nor fully below. She was not of the elite, yet neither was she one of the hopeful emigrants in steerage. She inhabited the space in between, where work blurred the lines between worlds. It is important to understand how these contrasts shaped Violet's experiences of disaster. On the night the Titanic sank, for example, survival often came down to where one's cabin was located, how quickly they received information, and whether lifeboats were accessible. First-class passengers, nearer the decks, with stewards to assist them, had greater chances of survival. Third-class passengers, deep below, faced locked gates, confusion, and a longer climb toward safety. Crew members like Violet lived in this strange middle ground, summoned to duty, even as their own lives hung in the balance. The same contrasts were present in ordinary, uneventful voyages. The wealthy dined on multi-course meals served on fine china, while in the crew quarters, meals were plain and functional, often eaten in haste between duties. First-class passengers walked promenades lined with wicker chairs, while the crew carried luggage up narrow stairwells. For the elites, the voyage was a leisurely glide across the Atlantic. For Violet, it was relentless labor making beds, carrying trays, soothing anxious travelers, all while battling her own seasickness. Yet Violet was not bitter about this imbalance. In her memoirs she wrote of her work with calm practicality. She described the endless tasks, the difficult passengers, the long hours, but without resentment. In her mind, it was simply the nature of life at sea, the rhythm of service. If anything, she seemed to take quiet pride in her ability to endure, to provide comfort, to keep her dignity even in the face of condescension or demand. What emerges from this picture is not just Violet's personal story, but the larger context of her era. The early 20th century was a time of transformation, of vast inequalities coexisting with new aspirations. Ships like the Titanic embodied this paradox, marvels of modern engineering that still carried within them the rigid divisions of an old-world society. Violet's life, spent between these divisions, illustrates how ordinary people experienced these structures, not in grand political terms, but in the small, daily realities of work and survival. As we move deeper into segment 4, we will see how Violet's later years reflected these contrasts still further, how she retired into quiet modesty, even as the legend of the ships she survived grew ever more grand, and how her own voice remained calm and steady against the backdrop of cultural fascination and myth-making. When Violet finally retired from the sea in 1950, she did so quietly. She had spent more than 4 decades in service, her life shaped by the rhythm of voyages across oceans. The sea had been her constant companion, sometimes gentle, sometimes merciless, and in leaving it behind, she stepped into a life of calm obscurity. She settled into a modest cottage in Suffolk, a place far removed from the grand liners of her youth. The cottage was simple, surrounded by hedgerows and fields, with the faint smell of salt air still reaching inland from the coast. For a woman who had once walked the ornate promenades of the Olympic and the Titanic, who had stood on the decks of the Britannic as it went down into the Aegean, this little corner of rural England must have felt both strange and comforting. It was the opposite of everything she had known at sea. Instead of the clatter of trays, the constant ringing of bells summoning stewardesses, and the ceaseless hum of engines, there was silence broken only by birdsong or the distant murmur of wind through grass. Her life in retirement reflected the same contrasts that had marked her years at sea. On the one hand, she was an ordinary woman, living alone, tending her garden, and writing letters. She lived without wealth or fame, supported only by her pension. On the other hand, her past was anything but ordinary. Few could claim to have survived 3 great shipwrecks, including one of the most infamous maritime disasters in history. Violet rarely spoke of her survival, not because she was ashamed or fearful, but because she seemed to feel it was not extraordinary. In her own words, she had simply done her duty and been fortunate to live when others had not. She was neither boastful nor eager for recognition. When she did reflect on those events, her tone was measured and calm, devoid of the dramatization others might have used. She remembered carrying an infant in her arms into a lifeboat on the night of the Titanic's sinking, but she spoke of it with the same evenness as she described serving tea in a first-class cabin. Imagine her in that quiet Suffolk cottage, the fire burning low, her hands folded in her lap. Outside, the world had changed immeasurably. Airplanes now crossed the Atlantic in hours instead of ships taking days. The age of the great liners was over. Their gleaming decks and sweeping dining rooms had been replaced by airports and crowded terminals. And yet, Violet still carried those ships with her, in memory if not in presence. Her reflections reveal much about the way society remembers versus the way individuals live. To the wider world, disasters like the Titanic came to symbolize human hubris and tragedy. Books were written, films were made, songs composed. Survivors became symbols, their experiences woven into a larger narrative of fate and caution. But for Violet, these events were simply part of her working life. She did not see herself as a heroine or a legend. She was a stewardess, doing her job, enduring hardship, and moving forward. This quiet acceptance is striking, especially when set against the fascination others expressed. As years passed, people sought her out for interviews. They wanted her to relive the night the Titanic went down, to tell them what she saw, what she felt. She would oblige, gently and politely, but she never embellished. There was no dramatic flourish, no attempt to cast herself as the center of history. Instead, her recollections remained grounded, factual, and almost detached. In one interview later in life, she even admitted that she had once received a late-night phone call from a man who claimed to be one of the babies she had saved on the Titanic. The story, true or not, fascinated listeners, but Violet treated it with the same calm composure she gave to all her memories. She did not sensationalize it, nor did she dismiss it. She simply acknowledged it and carried on. In her retirement years, she kept a small garden. She grew roses and vegetables, enjoying the simple labor of the earth after decades of labor at sea. There was symmetry in that. After years of moving across oceans, she anchored herself to one piece of soil, nurturing it quietly. The contrast between those two phases of life, the restless mobility of her working years and the rooted stillness of her final decades, mirrored the contrasts she had always lived between worlds. It is also telling that Violet did not seek recognition during her lifetime. While some survivors of the Titanic became minor celebrities, giving lectures or publishing accounts, she preferred anonymity. Her memoirs, though written, were not published until long after her death in 1971. She left behind no great monument, no wealth, no sprawling estate. Her legacy was not carved in stone but carried quietly in her own memories and later in the stories others told of her. Her death, like her life, passed with little fanfare. She was laid to rest in relative obscurity. Her remarkable survival story known only to a small circle of historians and enthusiasts at the time. It was only in the decades that followed, as the Titanic story continued to capture the imagination of the public, that her name resurfaced and her story gained new attention. What emerges from this final stage of her life is the profound contrast between public memory and private existence. The world saw Violet Jessop as the woman who survived 3 shipwrecks. She herself saw her life as that of a working stewardess, one who endured seasickness, demanding passengers, and the occasional extraordinary trial. Where others saw legend, she saw routine, and in this lies perhaps the deepest truth of her story. Survival is not always accompanied by recognition. Great endurance can exist quietly, without applause, without reward. Violet endured not for fame but because she had to. Her survival was not an act of willful defiance against death, but simply the continuation of her duty, one day into the next, voyage after voyage, until her working life was done. As we prepare to move into the final part of this segment, we will turn from Violet's personal reflections to the broader, cultural fascination that surrounded the disasters she lived through. We will see how stories like hers became symbols of class, fate, and endurance, and how the calm reality of her experience contrasted with the myth-making that grew around it. As the years passed after Violet's death in 1971, her story began to take on a new life, not because she sought attention, but because society itself could not resist the allure of her survival. To the public, she became Miss Unsinkable, a title she herself would never have used. It was a phrase born not of her own words but of the human tendency to find symbols in the lives of others, to craft narratives that carry meaning larger than the individual at their center. The Titanic in particular had by then become more than a shipwreck. It had transformed into a cultural touchstone, a story retold in books, plays, and eventually films. The sinking was framed as a cautionary tale about human arrogance, about technology unchecked by humility, about class and inequality, about fate and chance. Every survivor's story was a thread in that vast tapestry, and Violet's thread stood out because it was entwined with 2 other disasters: the Olympics near catastrophe and the Britannic's wartime sinking. For many, it seemed as if Violet's life itself was symbolic of human endurance. She became an unintentional witness to the fragility of human endeavor and the unpredictability of chance. Newspapers, long after her death, began retelling her story with tones of amazement, painting her as the woman who defied the sea, and yet, the truth was quieter, gentler, and far less dramatic than these retellings suggested. Imagine for a moment how different the perception of Violet's life was compared to her own lived experience. For the public, her survival became extraordinary, something almost mythic. For Violet, it was simply part of a long working life, a life spent rising early, ironing uniforms, carrying trays, tidying cabins, and responding to the endless demands of passengers. The shipwrecks were interruptions, yes, but not the defining features of her daily rhythm. They were crises she endured, after which she returned to her duties. The contrast between myth and reality is striking, and it reveals something profound about how history is constructed. The survivors of disasters often become unwilling participants in stories larger than themselves. Their lives are rewritten by the collective imagination, turned into symbols of luck, fate, or endurance. In Violet's case, she was turned into a legend not for her deeds, but for her continued existence. She lived where others did not, and that was enough for the world to make her remarkable. There is also a social contrast here. Violet's own words suggest she had no sense of being particularly fortunate. In fact, she often expressed sadness about the lives lost in the disasters she survived. She was not boastful, nor did she revel in the fact that she lived when others perished. Instead, she seemed to carry a quiet grief, a recognition that her survival was entangled with the suffering of others. Where the world saw her as lucky, she may have seen herself as simply enduring, carrying the weight of memory. This quiet endurance reflects a broader truth about working-class lives in history. Often, it is not the wealthy, the powerful, or the celebrated who embody resilience most clearly. It is the ordinary individuals who continue, day after day, through hardship and loss. Violet's survival across 3 shipwrecks may be extraordinary, but it is also deeply human. She did not choose those events. She simply endured them, as so many ordinary people endure the trials history places before them. It is worth pausing to consider how Violet's story might have been different had she belonged to the elite world she once served. A wealthy passenger who survived 3 disasters would have been remembered in grand biographies, perhaps even immortalized in statues or memorials. Violet, by contrast, returned to a modest cottage, to her roses and vegetables, her quiet letters, her unremarkable routines. Her fame grew only later, pieced together from memoirs and fragments, often colored more by myth than by her own voice. Yet there is a certain justice in this. Her obscurity during life preserved the authenticity of her experience. She was not tempted to embellish, to shape her story for audiences. Instead, she told it as it was, calm, restrained, often understated. In this way, her legacy is perhaps more truthful than those who sought to dramatize events. She lived not for recognition but for survival, and survival itself was enough. As we reflect on Violet Jessop's life, we are left with a picture of contrasts, between luxury and labor, myth and reality, public memory and private truth. She was a woman who lived through events that became legends, and yet she herself remained grounded, modest, and unadorned. Her story reminds us that history is not only about the grand gestures of the powerful, but also about the quiet endurance of those who serve, who labor, and who survive without fanfare. And so, as this story draws to its close, we are left with a calming sense of balance. Violet's life, though marked by chaos and disaster, ultimately returned to quiet routine. Her final years were not spent on storm-tossed seas, but in the stillness of a country garden. The woman who survived 3 shipwrecks lived her last days in peace, a life shaped by contrasts but united by a steady thread of endurance.